change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
But we do know that all of Israel was circumcised at the original Passover in Egypt. We also know that all of Israel was circumcised when they received the law at Mount Sinai. And again, they were all still circumcised at the second Passover that they celebrated at Mount Sinai. And that's recorded for us in Numbers chapter 9. But it was after that Passover and after Israel went to Kadesh Barnea, we never read of another Passover being celebrated by Israel. And the rule was that all males had to be circumcised to eat the Passover. So Israel, they only celebrated 2 Passovers, and that's when I believe they stopped circumcising their children. And so now for 38 years, no one circumcised their sons or celebrated the Passover. And I don't believe it was because they couldn't. I believe it was because they didn't want to, and God wasn't going to make them anymore, because it had to be voluntary. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was exactly 40 years to this date where Israel had left Egypt. They just happened to be in the time of the Passover when they got to the other side of the Jordan. But before they can eat this Passover, all the males are going to have to be circumcised, because that is a requirement for the Passover. And you can read those instructions because they're in Exodus 12:49. And it wasn't just a law for just Israelites. It was a law for anyone, native or foreign-born, that all the males had to be circumcised. And so the first thing that Israel's to do for them now to be in the land is to restore their covenant relationship with God. Because even though they're all Jews and God has been leading them, they're not in covenant fellowship with God, because they no longer have the sign of being God's covenant people. And there is no one else on earth that had this covenant with God, of being God's covenant people. And this is the same covenant which gave Israel the right to the land. And it wasn't done because God needed to prepare the people physically, and he didn't need to prepare them emotionally. The reason the people of Israel needed to be circumcised is because they needed to be prepared spiritually, because it wasn't going to be their military expertise or their emotional stability to cause them to win any of these battles. But the battles will be won because the people have given themselves over completely to God. And you have to see here that God protected Israel here during this time, because they were weak from that circumcision. And you can read here that Israel crossed over the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. So the first thing they do is they renew this covenant that they had that was broken with God. And then God tells them that the reproach of Israel is now rolled away. And he calls it the reproach of Egypt. All right, and so there's different ideas what that means. Some people think that's about Israel and them serving the gods of Egypt when they were in Egypt and also in the wilderness. Others believe that it's the reproach of not trusting God at Kadesh Barnea when they were told to enter the promised land. But whatever that reproach was, it is now completely gone. And now here, every man bears that mark of his individual identification with God. And so now God uses this word, Galgal, which is the word for being rolled away. And it's a play on words with the name of where they're staying. Gilgal, that's where they're camping. And Gilgal means a circle. Okay, so now with their parents disgrace removed, and all of Israel, now they're all healing in Gilgal for 3 days, and now they're all qualified to eat the Passover. Because again, Israel is now again God's marked people, where now their bodies belong to the Lord, which means they have willingly put themselves under obligation to obey him, which is different than everybody around them. So Israel is to maintain their purity, and they're not to degrade themselves with sensuality with the idols. And they are once again now God's holy nation. And this is really important to do this before taking the land. Because when they get into the land, they're going to have more temptation to sin than when they were in the wilderness. Because in the land, they're going to be living among these pagan people who are enslaved by their immoral practices. And they're going to be tempted to compromise with their enemies, who happen to be their brand new neighbors. And even though this is just a little physical surgery, it's a symbol of something much bigger. This is a symbol of a spiritual operation that's happened to their hearts. Because all their parents, they were all circumcised physically, but they were never circumcised in their hearts. And what's a real shame is that later on in Israel, the people are going to think that it's the physical difference that made them spiritual. But it wasn't. It was always supposed to be their heart toward God, because circumcision was just an outward sign of what had already happened in their hearts. And this is the same for us. We are never to take our outward signs, things like baptism or taking communion, and ever to think that any of those things save us, because those two are just outward signs, and they're only meant to represent what's already happened in our hearts. So symbols and ordinances, they mean absolutely nothing without conversion. It's always the heart that matters. And so now, as their first act as God's people, Israel, for the first time in 38 years, they're going to celebrate the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, which means they've only been in the land for 4 days. And they never celebrated it in the wilderness. And as they sit down to eat this Passover, what this reminds me of Psalm 23, where it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Because they're going to be eating this Passover in the presence of their enemies, because Jericho is only 2 miles away. And once they start eating this Passover, and they start eating the bread of the land, and that bread was probably barley loaves, and it was unleavened barley loaves, because this is the time of year of the barley harvest. And that barley that they're probably eating, it's probably from the fields of the farmers that grew barley that probably all ran into the city of Jericho for the protection of their walls. But once they began eating this bread in this land, that daily manna, the bread from God, it stopped. And they weren't going to need it any longer. And so now this 40-year miracle is over, and it ends on the very same day as the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And some people, they do think that Israel's march around Jericho coincided with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that's because of all the sevens that are associated with the march. There was 7 priests and 7 trumpets, 7 days, and 7 times around the city. But nobody knows if it was, and it's not necessarily true. But now after this Passover, we have here Joshua, and he's walking around. And he's contemplating, well, how are we going to take Jericho? Because he doesn't have a plan, and he hasn't been given any instructions of what's going to be happening in the next few days. So he's at Jericho, and he sees a man, and he's never seen this man before. And this man, he not only has a sword, but his sword is drawn. And so Joshua, he doesn't immediately think this is a friend. And Joshua, he's alone. and he's probably startled. And we're told here that Jericho is all locked up. And so I would think that he's probably assuming that this man is from Jericho. But before he attacks him, Joshua shows some wisdom, because his initial thought would not be, oh, wow, this is God in human form. He's probably thinking he's going to have to fight this guy. And so he asks him, he says, are you a friend or foe? And the man refuses to answer Joshua's question. And he just says, no, because this person doesn't have a side. And then all the man does is identify himself, and he says, no, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And he uses the name Yahweh. And so this commander's allegiance is to Yahweh. It's to God. It's not to men. And he's not just a commander, but he's a commander of angels, the Lord's army. And so Joshua, he immediately falls before him and he worships him and he calls him Lord. And he asks him for instructions of what he wants to say to him. And the reason that Joshua didn't recognize him is because Joshua had never seen him before. And this is what is known in the Bible as a Christophany. And some people, they just call it a theophany. But this is one of those pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus Christ, where incarnate, it just means flesh, like carne asada. And we've seen a few of these in the Bible, where God had appeared to Abraham before Sodom was destroyed in Genesis 26:24. And he also appeared to Isaac this way. And he also appeared to Jacob when he wrestled with Jacob before Jacob met with his brother Esau. But we never read of God appearing to Moses this way. But this angel, it also appeared to Balaam's donkey, and it appeared to the donkey in the same exact manner as he is here, where with Balaam's donkey, he also appeared with his sword drawn. And one way to know that this is an appearance of Jesus and not just an angel of the Lord is that you never see any of God's angels ever allowing men to worship him. And then the commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua the very same thing that the angel of the Lord said to Moses, which was that voice from the burning bush at Mount Sinai in Exodus 3:4. And he says, take your sandal off your foot. The place that you stand is holy. And so even though Joshua had a question, the question here really is to Joshua. And it's really, well, whose side are you on, Joshua? And Joshua, he's probably very pleased to know there's another commander besides him. And it's a commander that outranks him, the one who's really in charge. So Joshua, he is really only second in command. And that's how it is for any leader in the church. The most you can ever be is second in command. That's the only way for any church to be successful. And anywhere that the Lord is, any ground where he stands is holy ground. And so now we start chapter 6, and before we're told what the Lord told Joshua, we hear that Jericho is securely shut up. And Jericho, it wasn't an exceptionally large city, but it was a fortress. And if Israel can defeat this city, they can defeat anything in Canaan. But before Joshua and Israel can conquer anything in the promised land, they themselves had to be conquered by God. And it's only because of God's wisdom that they're facing Jericho first. Because it's not like they're trying to work their way up to Jericho by trying to take on a few of the smaller cities. It's not like the playoffs where you kind of work your way up to play the harder teams. And really here, this isn't Israel defeating Jericho anyways. This is really God defeating Jericho. There is no human wisdom about this battle at all. They're using absolutely no military intelligence. There's no surprise attack. And all those events that we read in chapter 5, those would have taken Israel at least 10 days to complete. And so if you take those 10 days and then you add to that the circling of Jericho for 7 days, that means that it's going to be over 17 days in the land until Jericho will be taken. And so that whole purpose of chapter 5 was for them to become spiritually prepared. And you have to remember, Jericho knew that they were there the whole time. So this really is the Lord's battle. And so the whole thing for Israel here is a test. It's a test as if they will listen to God and obey him, then victory is assured. And everything that the Lord has told Joshua to do, it sounds crazy. It sounds like there's some kind of strange cult, just making a bunch of circles and then going back to their camp. But this is total obedience to God, no matter what he tells them to do. And this is just Israel making themselves totally dependent on God and not leaning on their own understanding. So this is the believing of God's promises. And here Israel is not fighting for victory. They are fighting from victory because Jericho has already been given to them if they obey. And that's how all our battles as Christians are to be won, because we too are always fighting from victory. All we have to do is to believe God's promises and to obey him, because it's just like what Jesus said in John 16:33, where he said, "Be of good cheer." And he told us that he has already overcome the world. And God here, he doesn't ask Israel to do anything great. He doesn't ask them to do anything hard. And that's because this is only a test. They only just have to obey whatever he says, no matter how ridiculous it sounds. So God's not asking anyone to climb the walls or to carry any heavy equipment around to knock the walls down. They just have to obey. And that's what you'll see throughout the whole scriptures. God never asks anyone to do anything too difficult for them. He only asks them to believe him, and he only asks them for their obedience to what he says. And so they're not to look at the difficult task that's before them. All they're to do is to look at God himself. And so what you see here, they never take the ark of God before them in battle. The priests weren't usually the ones to go first in Israel's battles. But here it's just like crossing the Jordan. They were to keep their minds on God, and they were to watch and follow God. They were to follow the ark. And no one has ever conquered a city this way before. And then every day they marched, you have to realize they were open to attack from Jericho, because Jericho had these high positions from their walls. And then here, when Israel marched around the city, it probably wasn't with all of their people. And it probably wasn't even with all their enlisted men from their army, because that would have taken them too long. Because we know from the census taken by Moses that there was over 600,000 men. But without those walls for Jericho's protection, it wouldn't have taken that many people to rush in and to take over Jericho. And if they did use too many men, those men would have been falling all over each other. Because you have to realize, Jericho is only 8 to 9 acres in size inside of the walls. And so it probably would have only taken these men only about a half an hour to 45 minutes to walk around that city. All right, so now we have this small group of men all armed for battle, and they're going to be followed by these 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets. And with those 7 priests, with the 7 trumpets, they're to be in front of the Ark of the Covenant and the people that are carrying the Ark. And then the Ark is to be followed by a rear guard of another group of armed men. And so what does this look like? What does this look like? This looks like a parade. And Jericho here, they're going to be entertained for 6 days by Israel, giving them a parade. And then after the parade, they're going to go back home. They're going to go back to their camp. And you can imagine this. And I don't know what kind of songs that the priests played on their trumpets, but it must have seemed not only odd to Israel, but it must have seemed very strange to Jericho. And then having 600,000 men, well, you would think that there would have been a lot of those men, because of the large number of men in their army, that they just wanted to attack Jericho, try to overwhelm them and to get it over with, and rushing upon them on the walls and then building these ramparts to breach the walls and just to be done with it all. And that was probably what Jericho was expecting. But instead, day after day, they just watch this crazy parade, and they're wondering, well, what kind of psychological warfare is this? But whatever it was, Jericho was frightened enough where they never made any attempts to come and fight, and they never made any attempts to flee. And this army, they weren't to say a word. It's just supposed to be this blowing of trumpets. And the trumpets here used, they were called shofars. And shofars are trumpets that are made out of these ram's horns. Shofar trumpets, ram's horn trumpets, they weren't used for war. The trumpets that were used for war were silver trumpets. Ram's horn trumpets are the kind of trumpets that are blown at religious feasts and festivals. And another name for the shofar is Jobel, and that's where we get that word Jubilee. And so with these trumpets, Israel here is not calling the people to go into battle against Jericho. What they are doing is they're just proclaiming Jubilee. Or in other words, Israel is proclaiming liberty. And what they're doing is they're just announcing that Israel is in the land and they're taking possession of what's been given to them by God. And so Israel marching around the city on the first day, they probably didn't know what to expect. And they wondered, will they attack us if they march? And every day they marched, they would have seen how impossible it would have been to breach those walls. And then every day they circled, they would see that red rope hanging out of Rahab's window. But I don't think she was probably waving to them and saying, hey, over here. And for 6 days, they walked. And that was the promise God had made to Joshua, that he would give Israel everywhere their foot trod, and that land would be theirs. And so like we said before, God gives them nothing too big to do. This was just a test. And if Israel was willing to obey God in the little things, and even if they didn't fully understand, he's asking them, he says, are you still willing to trust me? And then there's the seventh day. And the seventh day, it may have been the Sabbath day, because they did walk on the Sabbath day, because they walked for 7 days consecutively. And this day, they circled the city 7 times, and the trumpets blew. And Joshua told the people at the end of the 7th lap to all shout, and then the walls fell flat. And the only one to be saved were the ones in Rahab's house as a promise to her for hiding the spies. But everybody else was to be destroyed, along with the animals. And people, they tend to get upset about the death of all the people here. And they often look at God as if God's unfair or God's unkind.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel Waterford and Your Neighborhood Church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,